message is very, very simple. We want to educate the kids, not indoctrinate them.
She doesn't want these projects in her backyard, in Warringah. She wants them in yours.
What's wrong with Australia today?
For me, it's leadership. There's just a lack of leadership.
We should be energy independent here in Australia. We've got everything.
And it's good to see the community come out and really engage in this issue of parental rights.
You only have one vote, but it's very powerful.
G'day everyone, welcome back to another episode of Commanding the Narrative. My name is Stephen Tripp. Thank you to everyone who is watching this live on Facebook, Rumble and YouTube. If you are watching live, you can join us in the chat, or at some point during this interview, I'll put the link to StreamYard in the chat so you can call in and have your say, maybe ask a question to one of our guests. But I'm joined by Victor DL. Victor, you were on with me a few weeks ago in what I thought was probably one of the best Commanding the Narratives that we've had so far, where we focused on the marketing of some of the political parties out there. What was your thoughts of that? And welcome back to the show.
Yeah, thank you for having me back on. I really appreciate it. And I have to say, I love the new titles. Very, very good. Very professional. Yeah, I love it.
Well, that was an older one I just dusted off. So
was it? Oh. I like that one. I do like the new one too. No, look, it was great fun last time. And one of the things I really enjoyed, I probably struggled with it initially, was just how spontaneous it was. That they're not looking up the websites and then just going live and feeding is not my normal style, but it worked really well. And the results were, as we discussed that day, like quite shocking.
Yes.
To have two of our major political parties, which, on the international stage, another issue. But you would think that they would have their fingers on the pulse and be the leaders in everything, particularly online. Because as we discussed, this idea of online being 16 to 25-year-olds is about 30 years old now. We're all online, we're all on social media, and it is really leading the charge. It's where most people get their news now, if not also from independent media. So the fact that they were so amateur and so badly done was very surprising. And of course, we spent probably maybe a little bit too much time talking about how good the Greens were, but to be fair, it was exceptionally done, and it certainly should be something that the major parties are looking at if they want to engage online in any way, shape or form.
Yeah, no, definitely. We talked about them because they're light years ahead. So that's a real problem that the other parties have to address. But let's kick things off. The best way to support us, and I let everyone know every single week, is by heading to Buy Me a Coffee. Now, if you could head to Buy Me a Coffee and throw us a few dollars there, it would be much appreciated. It helps to pay for the live stream. It helps to pay for the website. And also, most importantly, gives me a warm and fuzzy feeling inside, which is very, very important in my book. Also, if you want to keep up to date with everything that's happening with Commanding the Narrative or the ex-candidates or some other podcasts that we do, articles I might write, or events coming up, head to commandingthenarrative.com. Top right-hand corner is the sign-up button. You'll get a weekly newsletter. It's the best way to stay up to date. Don't rely on social media. Don't rely on the censorship that happens out there. Head straight to commandingthenarrative.com and sign up, and you can follow us there. And just lastly, with this disinformation legislation looming soon, publications like The Light Australia might be the best way of getting information out there. It's hard copy. It's free. All The Light needs is distributors. If you are in the country and you want to distribute The Light Australia, please head to the website, thelightaustralia.com, and sign up to be a distributor. If you are in Sydney or close to the Northern Beaches, there has been a pallet that's already been paid for. All you need to do is call the number 0406 861 816, and you can sign up to or call up and let Paul know that you would like to distribute The Light. As I said, it's already been paid for, and you can letterbox it or get it out to local news agents or medical centers or whoever will be willing to put The Light out there. So it is a great initiative, and the publication, this latest edition, is excellent. So I think maybe, Victor, you should start writing for The Light.
No, I really rate The Light. I think that a lot of the ex-journalists or even potentially journalists that should be working in the so-called corporate media and making a living out of being reporters and journalists, this is where they publish. It's very well written, and the articles are always really on point.
Yeah,
I'm not
definitely.
just saying that because we need to, but they're very good. Yeah, it's a good read.
No. Even though there's some guy named Stephen Tripp who's published in the last 2 editions, I don't know how he got in there, but anyway, today's show is going to be a really good one because this is a guest I've been hoping to get on the show for a very long time. She's an economics professor, and I think that is top of mind at the moment with the cost of living issue that's, I think, going to dominate the next federal election. It seems to be the only game in town, at least in the political arena. And also top of mind for people that are just struggling to pay the rent or, maybe grocery bills or electricity bills and things like that. So we really want to flesh out her mind on all things the economy and cost of living. And also, significantly, she rose to prominence during the COVID pandemic and her comments around that. So we might discuss some of that a bit later as well. But let's bring her on now. Professor Gigi Foster, welcome to Commanding the Narrative.
Thanks so much, Stephen. Hi, how are you going? And how are you going, Victor? Great to see you.
No, very well, thank you. And thanks for coming on. Now, I did mention it just then, but I want to show you this graph. This is from Ipsos. Now, this tracks the trends of, what people are thinking out there in the community, what issues are really top of mind for them. And you can see there in the orange, that's the cost of living line. Now, that's up to 67% of respondents saying that's the big issue for them. So we can see that the cost of living is a massive issue for the electorate out there. And as I said, it's probably going to be something that the election that's coming up is going to be fought on. I think people understand that the cost of living is getting harder and prices are going up, but they probably don't understand the mechanisms to why we got to this point. Do you want to flesh that out a little bit? Because I think it's important for people to understand where this is, what's driving all of this.
Yeah, sure. So there's really 2 questions, I guess. One is, why has that kind of trend been as it has been that we just saw? So why have people increasingly been saying cost of living is their main issue of the day or thing they worry about? And then the second one is, why has, in fact, the cost of living gone up? Right? And that's really part of a broader question about inflation, and in particular, inflation of the prices that we pay for things at a rate that is greater than the inflation of our incomes. Because in some sense, if you think about it as an economist, if all prices and wages go up at the same rate, it kind of doesn't matter, because we're all just paying more because we've got more income for the goods that we had, right? So what matters is when you can no longer afford the same basket of goods that you used to buy with your current income. And that's what's going on. And that basket of goods, of course, is multifaceted. So people buy groceries, they buy electricity, they buy housing in terms of rents or mortgage payments. And there's a whole bunch of things that have happened since even before COVID, but that got particularly bad during COVID, which have fed into both the cost of living crisis and the kind of prioritization of cost of living above other things in people's minds. The first thing that I would mention is, during COVID, of course, we had the JobKeeper, JobSaver programs to sort of staunch the wound that we self-inflicted by the lockdowns. And those programs also were coupled with special allowances from the government that we could take money out of our super accounts. Do you remember that? And use that because of, in particular, financial stress. So there were assistance, special one-off kind of deals that the government was giving to people during the COVID crisis, which was mainly man-made, actually, the crisis itself. The COVID bug is nasty, but the COVID policy response was far nastier. And those special assistances kind of ran their race. They had a particular period during which they were definitely providing help for people. And in some cases, people got a lot more income than they would have if they'd been in a job. And you can see this on some interesting graphs that Vic may see or may share with us later. But that essentially enabled some people, at least, to save and to kind of shore up their finances for a rainy day. Rainy days, of course, eventually did come, counter to the prognostications of governments during the period, the early COVID years, when I remember asking at least one central banker, aren't you worried about stagflation because you're pressing pause on the economy while flooding it with money? That's classic stagflation territory, and I was almost laughed off the Zoom call. But of course, eventually we do get to a position where we're not exactly in the stagflation that we had in the 70s, but we definitely are seeing a shaky kind of disrupted economy together with inflation.
Sorry, just to jump in there, can you explain what stagflation is for people out there?
So stagflation is a combination of two words, stagnation and inflation. So back in the 70s is when the term was really coined, at least in my parents' generation. They would tell me about it. And actually, stagflation is the only reason why I was able to go to an Ivy League university. I'll tell you that story in a minute. But essentially, it's that horrible combination where the prices of things are going up, but economic activity is in the doldrums. So you're not really creating more for people in any way. You're not, productivity is often slumping, and factors of production like labor and capital are not getting together to make stuff, right? And so you just have idle capacity and rising prices. So in the mid 70s in the US, there were price caps, rent controls, wage freezes, all these sorts of things, these draconian measures that governments implemented to try to sort of rein in those rising prices. And the interest rates were very, very high. And that is why I was able to go to Yale, because my grandmother, in her infinite wisdom, bought some zero coupon bonds at the height of the inflation crisis, which then paid off 25 years later or whatever. And I was able to go to college. So, otherwise I would have gone probably to a local college or something. So that is what I was anticipating might happen again, or some variety of that, because we were flooding the economy with money, which is inflationary. Plus, we were telling businesses they had to stop working, which is basically stagnation through government diktat, right? So it's essentially the same combination. So I think people had the help from JobKeeper, JobSaver, Super, etc. for a while. The interest rates, of course, were left constant for quite a long time until inflation did finally start going up, and then the central bank, the RBA, started finally ratcheting up rates. Philip Lowe lost his seat because of basically having been scapegoated for the cost of living crisis. I think that was not fair. The main cause of it was actually the government's fiscal expenditure. That is the things that got spent by the government that otherwise wouldn't have been spent because of the COVID crisis. And of course, we also hear that the Russian invasion of Ukraine is to blame for energy prices going up. If you look at the track of energy prices, they were starting to rise before February of whatever that year was, I think 22, when Russia invaded Ukraine. So it was already happening that inflation was on the rise. Again, I think predominantly because of fiscal, irresponsibility, I would actually say. And of course, it didn't help then, the invasion. So now, of course, we have seen in the most recent budget that there's tax relief in the form of the final, stage 3 tax cuts, reformed, and also subsidies for people who are struggling with energy bills. That's the most easy and short-term way to try to assuage voters. Just give them money. And I think a lot of us were very disappointed by that. And there are a lot of other structural problems that are facing Australia that aren't really being addressed by our politicians. So people are now feeling the crunch. The interest rates are going up, so their mortgage payments are higher. That's mainly filtered through now. So even those people who are on variable rates for some period, but not the whole period, they're now pretty much feeling it. And the rental market is also feeling it. So there's just a lot of pressure now on people's finances. The money's run out, and the labor market is okay, but a lot of people have actually been involuntarily stopping work. I've just looked at the data on this yesterday. The stopping work for illness and injury has gone up a lot this year compared to 2 years ago. It was even up last year a lot. So that doesn't look good to me. I think people are having trouble in the labor market of various sorts that aren't well picked in a lot of statistics. And so, yeah, of course, cost of living is top of mind.
Really, when you look at that, the data that you started with, though, Stephen, cost of living really is, I think it's influencing people, the top 7 issues coming up to the election, because you've got cost of living, housing, healthcare, the economy, crime, immigration, poverty. They're all very much interlinked and all linked into the cost of living. I guess when you're talking, and thank you for that, Gigi, one of the things that came to my mind as someone who is probably who is at the lower end of the earning, is how much of this, what we are seeing in the market in terms of like electricity, power, food, etc. How much of it would you say is necessary adjustment to the economy and to the market, or how much of it is, in your opinion, profiteering, or kind of the companies, individuals seeing that people are expecting now to pay more, they understand that they are suffering, but they are also having to pay for these things?
Yeah, it's a very difficult question, Vic, and I don't have a perfect answer for you. I can definitely say that even way pre-COVID, it was clear to a lot of international economists, people who were familiar with the way that things work in different countries, that here in Australia, we have highly concentrated markets. We have power concentrated in a small number of firms in many sectors. Supermarkets are the most obvious example that's been in the news recently here, banks as well. And if you look at particularly the profits of banks, 15-16% profit a year, that's way above the kind of standard economic profit that you would expect a competitive firm to have. Yes, so there we are. So what will happen when there's a cost of living crisis, not surprisingly, is people will look to to blame somebody. And it is quite easy to blame oligopolistic, as we say, or high market concentration sectors, such as the grocery store sector. And it's reasonable. Like there isn't that much competition there. Maybe you have 4 choices, if you're lucky, in your local area. And the investigation that was done into the supermarkets comes out of that concern that lack of competition is what keeps prices artificially high. And that's just a universal law in economics. If you have more competition, it will be better for consumers in the long run. It does mean that there's more pressure on those suppliers. And so in the short run, if you work for Woolworths, let's say, and there is an additional competitive force that enters that supermarket sector, then yeah, you might feel the pinch. You might not get a wage rise, or you might even possibly lose your job, right? So there is a short-term adjustment cost for the suppliers who are presently incumbent, but the value is for everybody, right? So the consumer welfare as a whole goes up when you increase competition in a particular sector. So that's why we've always, in economics, advocated for more competition. Now, I do think that there is a component, and certainly was coming out of COVID and for maybe a year or two after the first couple of years, that was real cost increases. So when you disrupt economic links the way that we did with lockdowns here and in other countries, you just, of course, are going to increase the cost of making stuff and sending stuff places and, just doing services, right? You're just increasing the cost of production. So that means that some of the prices that we saw on the shelves or at our retail establishments were higher because of real costs being higher. So it wasn't just the gouging, right? Now, the question is, how long does that sort of thing last? The only guidance I've got really on that in terms of what to expect is to look at what happened after the fall of the Soviet Union. So in 91, in the ex-FSU states, there was an immediate kind of magical disappearance of the central command and control mechanism that had, to that point, controlled and directed production in all the different satellite states. So, the people in Moscow would say, okay, you guys in Kazakhstan, you produce 200,000 left galoshes. You guys in Georgia, you produce 200,000 right galoshes. And they would just do it, even though it was inefficient, but they'd at least know what they were supposed to do, right? And so they do it, and that all kind of limped along for quite a while, as we know. And then when that command control sort of mindset finally was gone, those people essentially lost their script. There was nobody directing anymore to say, you do this, you do that, which meant that all of these factors of production, as we say, the capital, the factories, the people working in the factories, the machines, they were all still capable of doing things, but the people who directed them didn't really know what to tell them to do. Will we still make 200,000 left galoshes? Maybe we should make, I don't know, something else that's rubber and might be more saleable. Maybe we should make wiper blades. Maybe we should make, I don't know, rubber gadgets for medicine or something. And so all of the kind of reformation of business links had to happen to get those factors of production taken up again so that they weren't idle and they were actually in use to make something and contribute to the world. That process took about 6 years to fully complete. So if I think about how many years should we be expecting that the disruptions we forced on Western economies during the COVID crisis would take to play out, I mean, 6 years is an outside because, of course, it was a more catastrophic change in the FSU case. But a few years, I think, is probably reasonable. So we're now at 2024, 4 years after the crisis. I'm starting to think that probably most of those cost increases have been dealt with, and links have been reformed, and innovation is now sort of capable of taking off. And now the main thing we need to do, I think, is get the government out of the way, because we've had this government overreach mindset for so long now. And I mean, it was even there before COVID, but it certainly got worse during COVID. And people still look to the government to solve economic problems. Even economic students, if you ask them, here's a problem, what do you think should happen? They'll say, oh, the government should subsidize that, or the government should have this new plan, or this new special, scheme to give rebates or something. The government is the one that's supposed to solve problems. That's not how it works. Economic problems get solved by economies mainly, and governments just providing a stable, secure base of contracting and some public goods provision like roads and stuff, and kind of sticking to their knitting, So I think we need to get back to that mindset if we really want to unleash the power that people have to innovate and recover from this economic disruption.
But I brought up the article before where people were blaming the supermarkets for cost of living, and that's where their focus is. But you also touched on the reckless spending that happened during the COVID period, and the panic that was induced by the panic of the whole COVID scenario. But this spending that's been going on by governments, not just here in Australia but all around the world. You didn't get anything out of it. You can't point to anything and say we've got a new road or a new hospital or
Nope.
a new bit of infrastructure, something that we can point to and say, that created jobs or that sort of thing. Wouldn't the natural response from a government after a period like that would be to cut back on spending and rein in their spending? But it doesn't seem to be happening. There's still money being pumped into the economy. There's still money, like billions of dollars of subsidies going to the renewable sector, for example. Like, the spending continues. Shouldn't it have been reined in straight away?
Oh, Stephen, how naive to the dynamics of power. I mean, maybe you're saying that to be a straw man, but yes, of course, a benevolent dictator, of whom there are none, but we are taught about these people existing in economic analysis, a benevolent social planner would have absolutely reined back in the spending. And in fact, they wouldn't have done the spending in the first place because they wouldn't have implemented lockdowns, right? So we would be in a completely different world if we were being led by people who actually prioritize the welfare of the Australian people. Yeah. So we're not in that world, right? We are in the world where the people in authority who implemented lockdowns then had to follow that with things like JobKeeper and Job Seeker or Job Saver, because otherwise people would starve and they would complain, rightly so, at not being able to do their business. And then eventually, when COVID finally passed, the people in authority essentially now don't really want to remember what happened, because they don't want it to be basically critically analyzed. They don't want people saying, hey, I think that was a mistake, because the amount of damage that has been done to this country during the COVID era is eye-wateringly large, eye-wateringly. Right. And government.
I just want to jump in very, very quickly to make this point. People forget this, but just before COVID, Josh Frydenberg, who was the treasurer, was talking about a budget surplus, or getting the budget back on track. This was right before COVID hit, and then it all went out the window.
Yep. No, totally. And if people are interested in learning more about how the COVID crisis unfolded, what happened, why it happened, I wrote a book in 2021 with my co-authors Paul Frieders and Michael Baker called The Great COVID Panic, which you may be reaching for right now. There we go. So The Great COVID Panic, What Happened, Why, and What to Do Next. It's a Brownstone book, Brownstone Institute's first book. And it's on Amazon, whatever. But anyway, we talk a lot about what happened, how that could have happened. There's a lot of different elements you need to understand, including the dynamics of power, including psychology, the psychology of crowds, which is a very interesting topic on its own that we could have a whole separate podcast on. And also notions of personal identity, self-perception, ego. And a lot of that stuff is still relevant today. So again, the people in authority and many people on the street do not really want to interrogate what happened during COVID, because if they were to see the reality of how much damage they have done by either active, decisions on policy or being complicit and sitting by while this happened and not saying anything, they would probably get the shock of their life, right? It's just too painful, because we all love Australia. We love our kids and our parents and, you know, our friends and our family. We don't want to hurt them. A lot of people thought they were helping when they did those things during COVID, like taking kids out of school and masking people up and not seeing their mother who was dying alone in the aged care facility, all these things. They honestly told themselves, this is a good thing. I'm helping society. Untrue. You were had. And that is a very painful lesson, right? So I think now we have people in authority who simply have been unmoored by their moral bankruptcy during the COVID policy era, and they're unable to kind of get back on mission, which is do what's best for Australia. They are instead simply in politician mode of, okay, I've got to try to rescue my reputation and my legacy here and stay in office if I possibly can. What helps me stay in office? Making people feel like I'm doing something for them. Well, let me give them a subsidy. Let me give them, you know, a nice slogan. Let me try all my politicians' tricks. There's no real consideration of the structural issues. There's a lot of just total inefficient lip service and, you know, just detachment from the real needs of the Australian people.
Yeah, if I can say, you gave a timeline in Russia of 6 years, and I deliberately made a point of that because the real wages have only just returned, I believe it was last month, to September 2019 levels. So well done, you're pretty much spot on there. It's just over 5 years for that to happen. But don't get me started on COVID, because you know that I could talk about that for hours.
Me too.
And I'm not. Yeah, I know, and I'm not sure that the audience came because we didn't really advertise COVID. So I'm hesitant. I want to, but I'm like, we should probably stick to the economic stuff. One thing that I am interested in, and I don't know if you'll be able to answer this, but I understand why people are concerned about groceries. I'm concerned about the price of groceries. But when you look at the consumer price index over the last 2 decades, you see that grocery food prices, yeah, sure, they've grown 62%, right? House of pricing has grown 98%, which is quite extraordinary. But the price of education and health has gone up 144%. So you and I both have, you know, quite strong links to education. Why is it? And you know, when we talk about education, people, for whatever reason, will immediately envisage university, but they're also talking about the price of primary and high school education in this country, which is getting extraordinary. And people are going bankrupt trying to put their kids through, you know, private school, high schools, grammar school, whatever it may be. Why are we as a population, and is it driven by the government, so fixated on groceries? When there are so many other sectors, even if you just talk about insurance, that has gone up more than groceries, that the price increases have been more.
I mean, I think the answer is probably the obvious one, that everybody has to eat. And not everybody is in a life stage where they're buying education necessarily. And healthcare, we do have at least Medicare, so people don't feel the crunch of that in every kind of, I guess, quartile of the income distribution. I mean, you may have private health insurance, you know, a lot of people have it if they have a high enough income, but, you know, a lot of people don't have that, and they just go and see a doctor and they bulk bill. And so they don't feel the pinch in their wallet. I agree with you completely about the excessive expenditure in education and health, particularly. And I think if you just approach it a way that you would do for any kind of standard investment, you want to see, well, okay, I'm paying more. Am I getting more? So you look at things like longevity, quality of life, in the case of health, right? You know, disease prevalence, disease burden, you know, the measures of how well we're doing basically in the area of health, and try to correlate that with the amount of spending increase. So if we've really increased spending that much, we've sort of also seen a pretty significant increase in these measures of health. In fact, we've lost tens of thousands extra people in Australia since mid-2021, and we don't have an increase in longevity since 2020. And you know, even before that, health prices were going up still, and we weren't really getting much of a bang for that buck. And there's a lot of stuff that we know works in health that we don't actually do. GPs, you know, off-label repurposed medicines for a lot of different kind of, you know, illnesses and stuff that people don't really need hospital care for. But what we get expenditure on, including like right around the corner from me, is massive hospital complexes. You know, we have this huge complex going up in Randwick, which says the future of health. I mean, it looks like Stalinistic, honestly. And it's called the Acute Care Services Building or something. And it's kind of scary. Like, I don't want to go there. I really don't. Like, thank goodness I haven't broken a leg or something recently. I would not want to go there. I would not feel comfortable or safe because I don't have any confidence that that means of delivering me healthcare is actually the optimal means of doing so. So I think what's happened there, and it has happened in many other sectors, is that there's been a gradual encroachment and entrenchment of particular interests, including large companies, government bodies, you know, big players, essentially, who have worked out how to kind of milk the system, the government budgets for health, and provide something that kind of can be sold as health, but it's not really health. So I think that we need a huge redevelopment of that. It's one of the things that Australians for Science and Freedom is looking at. Little plug for scienceandfreedom.org. We're having a conference next month in Melbourne, so hopefully some of your listeners can come. We'll be talking about renovation and restoration in a bunch of different areas, including health, education, the media, direct democratic reform, community strengthening, and all sorts of areas. And it'll be a super fun time.
I've put the link in the chat to StreamYard if anyone wants to call in and ask Professor Foster a question. But we have another economist in the chat, Virtual Wilson, who's asked this question. How much has immigration driven house prices higher?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think there's a few answers. The first answer is you have to, or the first component of the answer is you have to be careful what kind of immigration you're talking about. If you're talking about permanent immigration to Australia by skilled immigrants, right, that generally has been found in the economic literature to be pretty much uniformly positive for Australia, generally speaking. Now, there probably will be a little bit of an increase in unemployment occasionally in certain sectors by skill level, you know, in the short run. But there'll always be a recovery and a dynamic sort of response to the influx of immigrants. And the reason for that is because the immigrants don't just take jobs and houses, but they also give back to the economy by consuming, right? So they buy things and they essentially stimulate supply side actors to produce more. And so that means those actors need to hire more people and you know, just basically grow the economy. Now, in terms of house prices, I haven't seen a specific paper on that, but I would doubt very much that permanent migrants are influencing house prices through actually buying the houses and taking them from Australians in most geographical regions. Now, there are some exceptions. One of the issues is that we have a lot of temporary migrants, particularly immigration for education. So we have a lot of international students here at UNSW and other universities. And that, I think it's unavoidable to observe. That does put pressure on the rental prices in housing around the areas of those universities. So other students find it more difficult to crack into those markets. So I think that is part of what is keeping rental prices higher. I think that's fair. And there is also this issue of investment properties. I haven't done a lot of research on it, but I will mention that some people seem to say that having the ability to have multiple investment properties while not even living in Australia, possibly living overseas, can, you know, be negative for prices, because essentially you're creating a dual market, one for investments and people who just have a lot of money and live off of their investments, and then the other one for owner occupiers. And really it's the owner occupiers that we want. If you look around a lot of the big cities in Australia, you see a lot of vacancy, actually. You see a lot of houses that are not full, or they're not actually holding all the people that they could hold. And I think that also points to some planning problems, some zoning issues, and some failure to address the structural causes of the housing crisis, which maybe doesn't have to be as much of a crisis if we were to better use our existing capacity. So there's a lot of things going on with housing, but yeah, I do think that we have too many international students, definitely. I thought that for years. I actually published a paper in 2012 in the Economics of Education Review, if anybody's interested, about exactly this issue. And nothing against the international students themselves, but I think the system fails them and it fails Australia.
They actually, I know Victor's got a question, but just to jump in, the sense, I've just gone out of my head now. you know when they poll everyone. Oh, it's gone anyway. It'll come back to me, but it basically was saying that there's a million properties vacant in Australia. So they're just sitting there. They're owned by someone, whoever may own it, but they're unoccupied. So that's contributing. The census, that was it. I don't know how that went out of my brain, but the census showed that.
Yeah, no, that's a really interesting point. And you have to ask, why is that, right? And some of it could be investment properties by people who just don't really need it. It's maybe their fifth or sixth and they haven't gotten around to renovating it or renting it out. It could be people who inherit those properties and don't actually have the money to renovate them. So that's another whole issue with, should we have an inheritance tax or somehow force resale of some properties, at least on if those properties are coming into hands that are not solvent enough to look after them. So yeah, figuring out why exactly so many houses are vacant and then trying to address that problem with policy, I think would be a really fruitful direction.
I did have a question before, but you just mentioned inheritance tax, which is very interesting because I made a bit of a side point because I can go off on my conspiratorial rants. Okay, so I want to kind of rein that in and not get too crazy with people. But it is a true fact, right, that over the next 2 decades we're going to see the largest transfer of wealth in terms of inheritance in the history of mankind. And just to put some sort of figures and perspective on that, just in Australia, in the next 2 decades, 4.3 trillion, that's with a T, is going to be passed down from the baby boomers to the current generation. Now, I'm not over alarmed about that. This is just the reality of the way it is. But I guess the way I kind of look at it, particularly in the context of the fact that this cost of living crisis, the housing crisis, all of these constant crises, which all kind of seem a little bit manufactured to me in order to justify a lot of policies, how much of what is going on is about trying to get their hands on some of that money? I know it's probably not really a question for an economic professor, but I do think it is something that some people in power and amongst the elites and the globalists would be thinking, and particularly in the Australian marketplace, because in the Australian marketplace, we have a very unusual position where that $4 trillion, most of that in terms of like who owns that is ma and pa. So 70% of that 4 trillion is ma and pa baby boomers who just invested, got some properties, got lucky with the market. Only about 30% is actually owned by what we would traditionally say is the top 1%. Now, everywhere else around the world, that figure, as you know, Gigi, is very much in the reverse. So 70 to 80% of the wealth is held by the elites, and the rest of us just get the crumbs. So this is a very interesting position for Australia to be in, that the wealth is in the hands of ma and pa investors. And I do, like, as conspiratorial as it sounds, I do think that there is some relevance to the argument to say people are looking at that money and they're thinking, how can we get access to that?
Oh, look, I mean, elites, of course, want to have more money, more power. I mean, that's just a fact of life. So I don't think that's conspiratorial at all. That's just being honest about human nature and about the realities of what power does to you, right? Power corrupts and it makes you corrupted away from the supposedly noble mission that you were called into government to serve, right? So trying to actually be the servant of the people is not usually, I mean, there's a lot of lip service given to that, but I don't see that the actions really meet that, as we discussed earlier. Inheritance taxes are a really interesting one because, I mean, you can make really good arguments on either side. From my perspective, one of the reasons why you see the pattern that you just spoke of, where so much of the wealth is held in mom and pop's hands, is because of our exceptional rise in house values since the 70s, 80s, right? And so if you happen to buy a house in, Bondi or Balmain or wherever in 1972 or whatever, and you still have it today, boy, oh boy, have you hit the jackpot, right? And the problem is, think about this from the perspective of, the whole society. We now have very, very, very valuable houses held in the hands of people who just kind of got lucky, and they got to do something with those houses. And they are naturally going to, of course, give them to a child, probably, right? That's what we normally do when we pass on. But then if that child is either not interested in the house or not solvent enough to maintain it, not able to actually rent it out, to use it in some way, then it may just become one of those vacant, million houses in the country. And from a kind of fairness perspective, you do want people to be able to devote and distribute their hard-earned profits, money from their working life in the way that they see fit. But if this was basically about luck, happen to get lucky, happen to buy a house, happen to get really rich with that house, wealth-wise rich, maybe not liquidity, but wealth-wise, then is it, I don't know, in some sense, that is just kind of tying up your own luck rather than really a reflection of your effort. And so there may be a social argument if we want to reduce inequality, wealth inequality, which is much, much higher than income inequality in this country, to redistribute on point of inheritance. Because it certainly isn't your child who either, well, they got lucky to be born to you, but they certainly didn't necessarily do anything to earn the reward of having that huge amount of wealth. So from an economic fairness standpoint, it's kind of, keeping it in the family is not really in line with the best interest necessarily of society if we think we've got too much wealth inequality, which a lot of people think we do have. So it's not easy, right? You can see arguments on both sides. I think probably the most logical, and in many cases this is the case, the most logical, sane sort of policy would be somewhere in the middle, where you say, okay, maybe $2 million is tax-free, whatever. And then beyond that, it's a 15% tax or whatever on wealth, not income. And of course, if it's wealth, you can hide some wealth overseas, and people will, but you can't hide Australian property overseas. So that's why it should be counted. And then hopefully that would force some sales and then release some of those properties into the market to be reallocated to people who really do, from an economic efficiency standpoint, deserve to have those houses. And so, it's not easy. I don't love the idea of redirecting people's wealth or income, but I also see it as a huge cause of inequality in this country, particularly. So I think we could use some really good, debates and discussions about those kinds of policies.
So we've identified some of the causes, and I think we've kind of scratched the surface. We could probably go in deeper, but I really want to focus on solutions and reform. Obviously, we've talked about governments cutting spending, maybe cutting immigration, maybe some tax reform, somewhere. What would you suggest as an economics professor? What if you were in charge? If somehow you were in charge of the economy, and they said, Gigi, you can do what you like. What would you tackle first?
Well, the first thing I would do is make sure that in 6 months I have no power. Right? You have to institutionalize that. Do not get yourself into a position where you've got continuous power and you have the chance to keep getting reelected or repositioned, reappointed. Bad news for anybody's character, right? Second thing I would do is all the stuff you just mentioned, yes. And also, I think there's too much red tape and regulation in a lot of sectors. So the childcare sector is a good example of this. It's actually quite difficult to open a family daycare facility, which is, to my mind, just ridiculous, because family daycare is, from my reading of the literature, quite a good option for babies to age 3 or so, if the mother wants to rejoin the workforce. And I mean, I used it for my kids as well, and in the US, and it was fine. But here it's very difficult because of all of the red tape and regulation. And I think probably the same thing could be said of a number of other industries. So we need Australian governments to get out of the way of Australian industry, including the small and medium-sized enterprises, which feel a particular burden from that regulation. Large companies can often absorb regulation, including the COVID regulation, by the way. Small companies find it a lot harder because they don't have the margins, they don't have the scale. And so that's why a lot of the COVID policies were actually just a comparative advantage handed on a platter to big company, interests. So I think getting out of the way. I also think we need, in relation to this power stuff, we need to rediscover how to actually have direct democratic voice in the distribution of our national resources. At the moment, people just vote once in a while. They usually only have 2, maybe 3 choices. They don't really know what those people stand for. They see the big parties and they go with their, kind of what they've done in the past. But there's no really direct connection between policies that matter to the everyday Australian and their choices in the ballot box. And so what I have proposed elsewhere, and Vic knows about this, is to use the system of juries that we currently use in the criminal system to actually replace the political appointment mechanism that's currently used to put in place the head of the public service and other publicly funded bodies. So instead of having the, let's say, Department of Education head appointed by the politicians of the day, when that position becomes vacant, you would convene a jury of citizens, representative of Australia, and that jury, maybe 20, 30 people, would work for 2 or 3 months with one job, which is to appoint the next head of the Department of Education. And they could use whatever they needed from the state resources, have interviews, get experts coming in, telling them about stuff, but it's their choice. It's not a politician's choice, it's their choice. And if you were to do this and have one jury per role as they came up over the course of, let's say, 5 years, you would end up with a cadre of people who were leading public sector institutions who hopefully in expectation would have more the interests of the welfare of the people in mind than the interests of the political class. Because I think that is one of the big problems we face today, is a lot of this sort of redirection of public money. We were talking about the health system, even the education system previously, redirection of that money away from what's good for Australians and towards what's good for the entrenched, powerful classes in our country. I can go on, but that's one big one. And that affects a lot of things because it's all the different sectors, right? It's policy making in lots of different sectors that you'd be trying to influence.
Victor?
Oh, I've always got a question, but I always like to pause and let you jump in.
Jump in, mate.
Sorry. Well, I'm very much aware of the time. And I just, obviously, I just want to go back to the economic question. And when you're coming on, Gigi, I started to reflect on what could I read in preparation for today, because, you know, I like to prepare a lot, maybe too much, whatever. And I don't know why, but Naomi Klein's book, The Shock Doctrine, came to my mind. And I think it's because all the pieces of the puzzle, I know that book is quite old now, maybe 2006, 2008, but for people that are not familiar with it, it's basically this idea that of what she termed disaster capitalism. So it is the idea that the elites, politicians, everybody, now, not everybody, the people in power, take advantage of suffering, basically. And the reason that came to mind, I think, is because one of the questions I had prepared for you is, how is it that we are seeing so much synchronization across the entire Western world? We used to a certain degree in the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, see these pockets of things happening in Australia, and then it might happen in the UK, or it might happen in the UK, then Australia. But it was unusual that you would get this almost in sync things happening, issues happening constantly all around the Western world. And I know that's a very Western perspective, but it is where we come from. So what do you think about this idea that we are just constantly in a state of panic, constantly in a state of disaster, wars, everything else, in order to just push through policies that would potentially be unpopular or not get through if we weren't in this constant? Because it has to be said that people were exhausted after the COVID. And then we immediately entered into the cost of living crisis. And then we have this flow of policies, whether it was the World Health Organization or this disinformation, misinformation bills, they're just constantly hitting us. People are exhausted. And I think that, anyway, I'm answering my own question.
No, I totally agree with you. People are exhausted. And in fact, I'm going to be giving a TEDx UNSW talk next week on Thursday night at UNSW campus on exactly this issue. So the title of the talk is The Manipulators Playbook. And it's exactly about this issue that you raise of how people can be exploited, particularly when they are weakened as a population. And we are weakened when our community fabric frays, when we are under severe economic distress, when we are have a great fear of some kind of external threat. And the pattern that I'll be talking about is that people in power in those situations will exploit the weakened population and propose policies that are good for them politically and also happen to be destructive to the society, which is usually admitted only much later in the history books. And usually those policies involve a sacrifice. Typically, the sacrifice is something, some moral principle or a right or something, assumption that you've just taken for granted as being patently obvious until that point. And we saw that pattern in the Cultural Revolution. We saw that pattern in the rise of the Third Reich, and we saw that pattern in the COVID era. And I'll be talking about all three of those things at the TED Talk and trying to sketch the parallels. My aim is to help the audience see this dynamic and not give in to that manipulative dynamic by the people in authority, because they will be tempted to do that. And the question of, why has it happened all over the world? people, there's more communication around the world. There are more multinational organizations now than there used to be, and there's more regular meeting of these people. There's just, we're social animals. We pick up tips and tricks and ideas and ideologies from other people. I don't believe in a James Bond villain kind of guy who is behind all of this, but I do believe in parallel evolution and kind of, the notion that what people do is what's good for them. When they see a particular system working in another country, yeah, they're going to try to copy it if they can. So I think that's definitely true. I also think that there's a massive amount of incompetence in the cadres of so-called leadership in Australia, massive amount of cowardice, lack of moral courage, and also an awful lot of willingness to delude and rationalize and justify without ever actually reaching the bottom of the barrel, like without actually facing the true nature of a problem. There's just this kind of skating along the surface and doing what I think I can get away with, or what I need to do in order to sleep at night, and that's enough. Kind of attitude. And that's not the attitude that the best politicians in history, I think, had. The people who really cared about their countries, they sacrificed years of their lives because of their service to their countries. That and they suffered a lot. All right. And that's part of the calling. If you're going to serve a whole people who are very diverse and going to challenge you at every step of the way, and may sometimes fight against policies that are maybe a good idea for them, but they don't see it. Like, during COVID, we were saying, lock us down, right? That's the wrong thing to do. The politician needed to have courage to stand against that. That's just what the job is. It shouldn't be.
What's just about courage, though, Gigi, because while they're locking us down, Boris Johnson, for example, is having parties with his staff in number 10. And more closer to home, one of the things that has caused a massive, understandably, in the media this week has been in the middle of a housing crisis and a cost of living crisis. We've got Anthony Albanese buying his soon-to-be wife a $4 million luxury beach house. Sorry, beach house, not house. I mean, just the fact that it's a beach house just makes it so much worse. And then in order to be like bipartisan, you got Peter Dutton, who sold a luxury a penthouse in Brisbane, and that was over 3.4 million. And that's 12 months after he sold a house on the Gold Coast for over 6 million. So, I mean, there's almost like an arrogance to the way that they are behaving towards us now. So, it's like they can almost complete tone deaf to the point of being arrogant and just.
Well, and I mean, of course they're arrogant. I mean, it's even more than arrogance. I mean, it's almost dehumanizing people who are not in that elite, because these are people who are right in those networks we talked about. That's the elite right there. These people are members, right? They will be in that elite for the rest of their lives. And there is this us versus them kind of tribalism dynamic that, our good mutual friend, Professor of Psychology Joe Forgas at UNSW always talks about. Tribalism is so important. There is this tribalistic dimension now to the Western elites versus the Western population. It's not there with the BRICS countries. Right, you don't have this same. You have other problems in the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, etc. But you do have this problem in the West, and the BRICS countries' leadership can see it as well. And they've commented on it, how essentially the Western elites are betraying the Western populations. And I think it tells you a number of things. Amongst those is that we don't have good voice mechanisms anymore. We don't have the ability to vote out of office bad people, because pretty much everybody we get as an option at the ballot box belongs to one of these kind of corrupt organizations in a large political party. Whatever has a history of donations and backdoor dealings and just revolving doors with other people in power. Very hard to get away from that, because a small amount of that is normal in everybody's life. We all have networks, we all have Rolodexes, right? We all kind of call people we know when we need something done. So it's sort of a natural human dynamic, but taken to an extreme in the situation where you have access to the resources of a whole country, and you can then divert those resources to your own personal ends. So yeah, I totally agree with you, of course. Yeah.
Now,
Yeah,
I want to.
Sorry.
No, you go, mate. You finish up.
I know. Just wanted to say, speaking of tribes, I think that it is also important to mention that with the advent of postmodernism, what has happened is the tribes, in my belief, used to be larger, quite large, and therefore more powerful. But what this postmodernism has done, and for people that don't know what that is, just think about woke things. Destroying people based on language, breaking down people based on identities, which then get broken down into further identities, which then get broken down into intersectionality. What that has done is just smashed the communities in Western countries down to such a degree that we're almost like alone. Because what we saw during COVID was not just the breaking down of communities, but was a turning against each other within family groups.
Yep.
You know, I was banned from visiting some of my brothers and their wives and their kids. So, you know, it's just this constant dismantling of this idea of society, community, and rallying around things like an identity of being working class or middle class or an academic. It's all been smashed apart, and it's all deliberate. And look, I don't want to like cheer on the bricks too much, but you haven't really seen that same level of postmodernist uptake within those countries. It has definitely been shunned. And because of that, they do get a lot of air of the academic world in particular, but also mainstream press just constantly attacking them for their, you know, lack of inclusion and
lack of wokeness, whatever. Yeah, no, totally. And woke is very interesting. I mean, I blogged about that on Brownstone's site. We have a blog called What and Why is Woke, I think, which talks about exactly these issues. I also did a guest post on Rebecca Barnett's blog about this proposal to increase the hate speech laws in Victoria, about identification and exactly the issues you're talking about there, Victor. I totally agree. This is why ASF is focused on community fabric restoration, as well as restoration in the various different domains we mentioned before: health, education, media, etc. So yeah, and again, I want to encourage people to come to that conference. Also, in terms of education, I'm running a boot camp in December, which I should just mention because we're near the end of time. For people interested in a new university project, it's called Academia Libera Mentis, or Academy of the Free Mind. And there's a boot camp running, as you can see there, 12th to 19th of December. You can just visit ASF's website and look at the events page to see what you need to do to indicate your interest in that. It's for young people age 18 to 30, because I do think we need more young people involved in the movement and learning to think critically about their world, and pro-socially and openly, and to orient their lives towards actually being stewards of their society rather than just sitting around passively and kicking back and have a barbecue all the time. So that's kind of been the Australian way.
All right, I just want to squeeze in a couple more questions, and maybe we can do these rapid fire. But this one's a selfish question. It's around taxation. I work night shift, so obviously I get an increased rate for working night shift. I've only had one night off this whole month because you know, if there's money to be made, you jump in there and make hay while the sun shines. But that pushes me into the higher tax bracket. So the consequence of all that is that you get taxed more. So obviously I would be in favor of reducing taxation, but you need to be able to find a revenue source from somewhere else. Now I would say, what about increasing the GST possibly? So in that case, if people want to work more, they can. They don't get taxed as much, but if they want to spend, then they'll pay the consequences for spending. But then some people might say that that will drive inflation. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, so obviously I can't give financial advice, not being a personal financial advisor, but you're exactly right, of course. I mean, the first thing I would do, actually, I do think that we need to shore up the tax base of the Western countries, but I think the main way to do that is actually to look at the corporations and the corporate taxes, the multinationals, rather than necessarily the people in Australia, individuals. That's not where the big game is. The big game is the international corporations. So, and I think that we should focus on reducing the size of government. That saves money. Right? That saves money. So we don't need as much tax revenue if we can save money in terms of our expenditure. So I think those are the two places I would focus, rather than necessarily trying to get more tax out of individuals. You can certainly try to reduce the tax a bit. I mean, we did have the stage 3 tax cuts go through in amended form. I thought that was positive. But I think, yes, more could be done there too. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Final question. And this is the most important part of the whole podcast. It's called Build Your Own Fantasy Government. Now, Gigi, you're in control of the next Parliament of Australia, and you can choose 5 or 6 people. They can be anyone you want. Don't have to be politicians. Don't even have to be alive. People pick all sorts of different people. But the whole point is you get to head up the next government, and you can choose 5 or 6 people to hopefully run a good government here in Australia. Who would you choose?
Thomas Sowell, Milton Friedman, John Maynard Keynes, Russell Broadbent, Malcolm Roberts, David Limbrick.
Excellent. That's a few libertarians in there, so that's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, because I think we're at that point on the spectrum of the pendulum turning, right? It's not that I'm a libertarian dyed in the wool. I just think you need to react to where you are. Right now, we've got way too much government overreach. So we need people who have the commitment to bringing that back and understand how to do that, who are presently in power, and hopefully then that would serve its purpose, and then they could get ousted, and then we bring in some other people. But I do want Keynes in there.
Okay, maybe I can send that clip to John Ruddick. I'm sure he'd love to hear that. Now, just to finish off, let us know about all your upcoming events. You touched on some of them already, but just to reinforce it to the audience, the first one, I guess, is this conference, the second ASF conference down in Melbourne. That's happening in November. I went to the first one. I met Victor at the first one. It was fantastic. What can people expect at this second one?
Yep. So very similar to the first one, we're going to cover multiple different areas that need reform and restoration in Australian society. We have panels of some of the leading lights in the movement, in the Team Sanity movement, I like to say, from across Australia. I can't even remember all of them. There's all the names are on the website, but there's a lot of people you'll recognize. There we go. Thank you. And so we have panels in each of these different areas. And then on Sunday, I'm also doing a community restoration talk with Graham Hood. Some of your listeners will know Hoodie, the airline pilot, plus also Matt Wong of Discernible podcast. And then we have workshops on Sunday to really brainstorm and get into kind of the deep and dirty with some of the reform ideas that we've had. So it'll be a very exciting weekend. I can't wait to see everybody there and talk and further some of the plans we've got. Next week, again, is my TEDx talk. So anybody who happens to be in the UNSW area, they're welcome to come along for that. You can find that on Eventbrite. It's called Red Threads. Just, Google Eventbrite, Red Threads, TEDx, UNSW. There's a bunch of other people talking too, but that'll be Thursday evening next week. And then in December is the boot camp for Academia Liberamentis in Tenterfield, New South Wales. That's about a 3.5-hour drive from the Brisbane airport. So people who are in Brisbane, it's reasonably easy to get to, but you can also get to the camp if you can just get yourself to Brisbane. We'll have free busing from the Brisbane airport to the camp. Last for a week. It'll feature myself, Paul Freiders, who's one of my co-authors on the Great COVID Panic, Erica Turkstra, his wife, who does health systems, Andrew Lowenthal on media and sort of propaganda, Paul Conlon, who is author of Citizen One on the digital identity stuff and the human technology interface, and a bunch of other supporting cast characters, all teaching our areas of expertise with also physical and spiritual and community-focused development activities. So all very exciting. It's in a kind of rural community farm type place up there. So not 5-star accommodation, but it should be super fun and something nice to do right before Christmas.
Okay, thank you very much, Gigi. We really appreciate you coming on. Victor as well, I always appreciate having you on and your input and your questions as well. They're always very well researched and thought out. So thank you to both of you. And thank you to the audience. Thank you to the audience for joining us. I say it every single time. Please share this out. I think the topics and solutions, especially that Gigi covered today, is going to be a significant factor in the upcoming election. So I think we need to educate people on the issues. I know everyone can feel the hurt of the cost of living that's happening right now, but a lot of people might not understand it. So hopefully this podcast went some of the way of helping people understand why their prices are going up and why things are tougher than they have been in this country at the moment. So thank you both again. Thank you everyone for watching, and we'll see you all next time.
Thanks, Steve.